So an important thing to remember is that natural selection is not a process of creating new traits, but when new traits develop, the environment can select for traits that are present. So methicillin resistance probably existed in low frequency in the population, but maintaining that gene does require energy on the part of the organism. So an organism is going to invest that energy in maintaining that gene if it doesn't have to, because it's a waste of energy if you're not being subjected to that environmental pressure. So the local environment is going to determine what traits are going to be selected for or against within a population. Homology is another line of evidence for evolution, and homology is similarity resulting from common ancestry. So we can see that there are anatomical examples of homology, but there's also molecular examples of homology. And molecular homology is something that we're seeing more and more of as we learn more and more about how to resolve the sequences of genes and proteins. So homologous structures, here we can see the forelimbs of a human being like you or me: humerus, ulna, radius, metacarpals, carpals, phalanges, a cat, a whale, a bat. You can see that the same colors refer to the same bone in each of these particular organisms. And you can see they all have the same suite of bones. They all have a humerus, an ulna and radius, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, but you can see that they've been modified to suit the needs of that particular organism. So, for example, a whale is a swimming mammal, so it doesn't need to really do much with its flippers, rather than to use them with a lot of surface area and be thickened and strengthened to enable it to swim in water. So you can see exaggeration in the phalanges. The humerus, ulna, and radius are almost like a single unit that enable the whale to flap its fins. Whereas in a bat, you can see it is adapted for flight. The bones are very long and thin to make them lightweight, and the metacarpals and phalanges are very, very long and exaggerated to enable them to articulate their wings. And that's different from a bird's wing, as a matter of fact. Bat wings tend to have a lot more finger in them, whereas bird wings tend to be almost entirely arm. So all of these bones are homologous in that they evolved from a common ancestor, but we do see modification by the environment in which these organisms live. Comparative embryology is another way of looking at anatomical homologies that we don't see in adults. So, for example, when we look at embryonic organisms, it's kind of hard to tell what embryos correspond to what particular animal if you don't have context. So you can see that this chick embryo here, which is being shown through a light micrograph, kind of looks very similar to a human embryo. And if you imagine all the way back to the beginning, the zygote of a chicken doesn't look any different from the zygote of a human or a cat or a dog. But as they grow and develop, they develop more and more features of how they're going to look when they develop and are born or hatched. So, for example, in chickens and in humans and in all vertebrates, one of the characteristics we see is that we have these pouches in the throat area. These are called pharyngeal pouches, which are vestiges of gill slits that were found in our ancient ancestor. There's a post-anal tail You might say, well, where's my postanal tail? Well, it disappears as you were developing in utero. You used to have a tail, but you absorbed it, and you still have that bone in your pelvis. You have your coccyx, which has articulation points for muscles that our ancestors would have used to control their tails. And chickens still have tails, so they don't lose that postanal tails. So that postanal tail gives us another line of evidence for evolution, which is vestigial structures, which are remnants of features that may have served an important feature in our ancestors, but don't really serve us so well today. But they're still there because there hasn't been a selective pressure to remove that particular feature. We also see homology at the level of molecules. We can look at the DNA sequences of organisms and find genes that have a lot in common between organisms that share a common ancestry. So here are a couple of photomicrographs, light micrographs, of a plant pathogen, which is actually a protist, in the genus Phytophthora. Phytophthora is related to golden brown algae. And these Phytophthora plant pathogens do not photosynthesize, but they do have photosynthesis genes. And the question is, well, why would these organisms have photosynthesis genes if they don't photosynthesize? And the answer is because they share common ancestry with these golden brown algae that passed on those genes, and there hasn't been selective pressure to excise those genes from the genome. So they do still have them, which reflects common ancestry with a photosynthetic organism, the golden brown algae. We still use Darwin's I think model to consider how the tree of life has evolved through time. Scientists do use evolutionary trees to develop working hypotheses about relationships within different taxa or groups of organisms. We find that there are nested patterns within these evolutionary trees, and that these evolutionary trees can be deduced using many types of data. It used to be that we used anatomical data or physiological data, but more and more we're using data from DNA sequence, the sequences of nucleotides, or proteins. So for example, here is a tree, a nested hierarchy. You can see we can look at different types of birds, for example, within a lineage and say, well, ostriches are related to hawks. They're pretty close related to each other. All birds are related to reptiles like crocodiles and lizards and snakes. We share homologous characteristics. In the case of birds, they share the homologous characteristic of feathers. That's one thing that makes a bird a bird. Having hard-shelled eggs makes a bird a bird. Having a beak without teeth makes a bird a bird. But birds share certain characteristics with other organisms like crocodiles and lizards and snakes, and yes, mammals such as yourself and myself. For example, the amnion, which is a boundary layer in the fertilized egg. As an egg grows and develops, we have eggs that have an amnion, which enables them to survive on land. And the amnion is still present, even though mammals give live birth for the most part. We still have this vestigial structure of the amnion. Amphibians share digit-bearing limbs with all of these other organisms, whereas lungfishes, which are vertebrates but not land-dwelling vertebrates, do not have digit-bearing limbs, digits meaning thumbs and toes and fingers, for example. So we can see each of these branch points reflects an evolutionary event such as the advent of digit-bearing thumbs, the amnion, feathers, keratinized scales in the case of lizards and snakes and crocodiles. Those keratinized scales evolved into feathers in birds, and we have this nested hierarchy of relatedness. In addition to homologous structures, we see another line of evidence in convergent evolution, which is the evolution of analogous features. Analogous features are features that are similar in appearance or shape, but not through shared common ancestry, but through shared environmental pressures. So we can see that in similar biomes or habitats, different characteristics can be adaptive. So, for example, we've got here in the southeast a species of squirrel called a flying squirrel, which doesn't really fly, but it is able to glide from one tree to the next by means of large flaps of skin that attach the wrists to the ankles. And they also have these fancy racing stripes along the edge there and fluffy tails, just like a squirrel. In Australia, which also has these forested biomes, they have an organism that looks an awful lot like a flying squirrel, even down to the racing stripe and the white underbelly, called a sugar glider. And you might say, well, gosh, these places are so far apart. How does a flying squirrel glide from North America to Australia? And the answer is they don't. Sugar gliders evolved independently in Australia because there is a similar habitat that makes this particular morphology advantageous. And how do we know that they're not related to each other? Flying squirrels are placental mammals, meaning they are born alive from a placenta, just like yourself and myself, and dogs and cats and wolves, like this wolf up here, whereas the sugar glider is a marsupial. It is born in a pouch, just like a kangaroo or a koala bear, or, which is not a bear, it's just a koala, or a wallaby. And all of the mammals of Australia, the native mammals of Australia that are not egg layers, like platypuses and echidnas, are marsupials. So sugar gliders, no exception. So this is what we call convergent evolution, similarity in morphology based not on common ancestry, but on common environmental selective pressures. This organism down here is called a thylacine. It's also been called a marsupial tiger, or a Tasmanian tiger, or a Tasmanian wolf. It's called a tiger because it's got the stripes. It's called a wolf because it's it's a carnivore and it's got a great big mouth. Its mouth is huge. This organism is now extinct. The last ones died out in zoos in the 1930s. The last known one died out in a zoo in 1930. You can see this was a zoo specimen. But again, this is a top carnivore that evolved similarly to dogs and cats and other carnivores, but it is also a marsupial. So it's actually more closely related to the sugar glider, and the flying squirrel is more closely related to the wolf than any of these things are related to each other. Another case of convergent evolution or analogy, you can say all of these plants look kind of similar to each other. They're all kind of pointy and have these succulent thickened stems and spines, but they are actually a case of convergent evolution. These are actual true cacti that are found in North America. These over here are from Africa, and they are in the genus Euphorbia. If you go to Africa, you will not, and go to the Sahara Desert, you won't find any cacti. You might find some things that look like cacti and have these succulent stems that also use CAM, crassulacean acid metabolism, to reduce photorespiration. But this is another case of analogy or convergent evolution. Similarity, not by shared common ancestry, but by shared environmental selection.